15. On the philosophy of having. That which one has is one's property, and inasmuch as everybody has his body, it could be argued that property is rooted in the very physical existence of man. But even though this would appear to be a good argument for the universality of property, it hardly serves this purpose, because it is not correct. A slave does not own his body. It can be used, sold, destroyed, according to his owner's will and whim. The slave, in this respect, differs from even the most exploited worker. The latter does not own his body energy, because he is forced to sell it to the owner of capital, who buys his working power. However, since he has no choice under the conditions of capitalism, one must admit that even his ownership of his body is questionable. What does it mean that I own something when somebody else owns the right to use what I have? We are here in the middle of a much disputed problem, in which still a great deal of confusion exists, that of property. A clear understanding of property has been greatly obscured by the passionate feelings related to the revolutionary demands for abolition of private property. Many people have thought that their personal property, their clothes, books, furniture, and so on, even their spouses, would be taken away and nationalized. Note: I still remember vividly my shock at the fantastic report of the Frankfurter Zeitung, in many ways an equivalent of the New York Times, from Munich in 1919, that Gustav Landauer, one of the finest humanists of Germany, and at the time Minister of Culture of the short-lived Bavarian Räterepublik, had ordered the nationalization of women. End of note. Of course, the swingers today have in fact begun to socialize their wives among each other, although otherwise sharing politically conservative views. Marx and other socialists had never proposed anything as silly as that the personal property or things one uses should be socialized. They were referring to the ownership of capital, i.e., the means of production that enable an owner to produce commodities that were socially undesirable and to impose on the worker his conditions because he, the owner, gave him work. As a reaction against socialist demands, the professors in political economy asserted that property was a natural right, inherent in human nature, and that it had existed as long as human society. Attending several courses on economic history in 1918 and 1919, I heard two, at the time, outstanding professors lecture, in all seriousness, that capital was not characteristic of capitalism alone, but that even the primitive tribes who used cowrie shells as a means of exchange thus proved that they had capital, ergo, that capitalism was as old as mankind. Their example from primitive peoples was actually badly chosen. We know now, even better, that the most primitive peoples had no private property, except in the things that served their immediate personal needs, such as cloth, jewelry, tools, nets, arms, and weapons. In fact, most of the classical accounts of the origin and function of private property have taken for granted that in nature all things were held in common. The views of anthropologists I have presented in The Anatomy of Human Destructiveness. Even the Church Fathers indirectly accepted this view. According to them, property was both the consequence and the social remedy for the sin of covetousness that came with the fall of man. In other words, private property was a result of the fall, just as was male domination over women and the conflict between man and nature. It is useful to distinguish between various concepts of property that are sometimes confused. First, there is the view of property as an absolute right over an object, living or non-living, regardless of whether the owner has done anything to produce it, or whether he inherited it, received it as a gift or inheritance, or acquired it by theft. Aside from the latter point, which requires certain qualifications both in the relations between nations and the laws in civil society, the great law systems of Rome and of the modern state speak of property in this sense. Possession is always guaranteed by national or international law, i.e., fundamentally by the violence that enforces the law. A second concept, particularly popular in the philosophy of the 18th century Enlightenment, stresses that one's title to possess something depends on the effort one has made to create it. Characteristic is John Locke's view that if one adds one's labor to something that, at this point, is nobody's property, res nullius, it becomes one's own property. But Locke's emphasis on one's productive part in establishing property, originally, loses most of its significance by his additional qualification that the title to property one has established could be freely transferred to others who had not worked for it. Locke apparently needed this qualification because otherwise he would have run into the difficulty that workers could claim the products of their work as their property. A third concept of property, which transcends the aforementioned essentially legal concepts and is based on the meaning of property for man, metaphysically and spiritually, comes from those promulgated by Hegel and Marx. For Hegel, in his Philosophy of Right, sections 41 and 45, property was necessary because a person must translate his freedom into an external sphere in order that he may achieve his ideal existence. Since property was the first embodiment of freedom, and so is in itself a substantive end. While Hegel's statement may sound at superficial reading to be nothing but a rationalization for the sacredness of private property, it is indeed much more, although space does not permit an exposition of Hegel's philosophy that is necessary for a full understanding. Marx formulated the problem entirely ad personam and without any philosophical mystification. As with Hegel, property was for him an externalization of the human will. But as long as the property created was not his but the owner's of the means of production, as long as man was alienated from his own work, property could not be his property. Only when society was organized in a common enterprise, where the full development of the individual depended on the full development of all, mine or thine were meaningless concepts. In such a community, labor itself, i.e., unalienated labor, note, Marx's attitude toward unalienated labor remains contradictory. Sometimes he seems to consider unalienated labor the highest achievement of life, but his final conclusion is that free time and the unalienated use of it are the supreme goal of life. End of note. Labor itself, i.e., unalienated labor, would become pleasureful and possession aside from the objects that one used an absurdity. Everybody would receive not according to the amount of work he did, but according to his needs. Needs here, of course, real needs of man and not synthetic damaging needs, suggested to him by industry. A radically different distinction is that between property for use, functional property, and property for possession, non-functional, although there are many blendings of these two types. In German, the difference between the two kinds of properties is made clear by the use of two different words, Besitz and Eigentum. Besitz comes from sitzen and means literally that upon which one sits. It refers to that which one controls, legally and factually, but it is not related to one's own productive action. Eigentum, on the other hand, is different. While Eig is the Germanic root of haben, to have, it has changed its meaning in the course of many centuries, so that Meister Eckhart could translate it already in the 13th century as the German equivalent of the Latin word for property, proprietas. Proper corresponds to eigen. It means that which is particular of a person, as in proper name. Eigentum equals proprietas, property, refers then to all that is particular of a person as a specific individual, his own body, the things that he uses daily and to which he gives some of his individuality by this daily acquaintance, even his tools and abode, all that forms his constant surroundings. It is perhaps difficult for a person living in today's cybernetic society in which everything is obsolete in a short time, and even if it is not, it will eventually be exchanged for something newer, to appreciate the personal character of the things of daily use. In using them, one imparts something of his life and of his personality to them. They are not lifeless, sterile, or changeable things anymore. That this is true has been clearly demonstrated in the custom of many earlier cultures, by no means only primitive, to put in a person's grave the very things of his personal and daily property. The equivalent in modern society is a person's last will and testament, which may have its consequences for years after his death. But his objects are not his personal things, but precisely the impersonal private property he owned, such as money, land, rights, and so forth. We can conclude, then, that the most fundamental difference is that between personal and private property, which essentially is the same as that between functional and non-functional, dead property. This difference is by far more fundamental than that between private and public property, since, as many examples have shown, the legal form of a public or national or socialized property can be just as coercive and alienating as private property, provided it is managed by bureaucrats who only in name but not in fact represent the interests of the workers and employees. Functional and dead property appear often in their pure form, but they are frequently blended, as we can easily see in the following examples. The most elementary example is the body. The body is the only property everybody has. It is, as it were, a natural property. For the infant, as Freud has so brilliantly shown, the excrements are probably experienced as a still more extreme form of possession. They are his, the product of his body. He gets rid of them, but need not fear this loss too much, because every day replenishes the loss of the previous day. But the body, in contrast, is not only a possession, it is also an instrument, which we use to satisfy our needs, and furthermore it changes according to the use we make of it. If we do not use our muscles, they become weaker, flabbier, even to the extreme point of becoming unusable. On the contrary, our body becomes stronger and healthier the more it is used, of course within certain limits. In the case of having a house or a piece of land, the situation is different, because we deal here with a social category and not with a natural one, as is the case with the body. Let us think of a nomadic tribe. They did not own land. They lived on a piece of land for a while, used it, built their tents or huts on it, and after a while abandoned it. The land was not their private property, nor was it communal property. It was not property at all, but an object of use that was theirs only in the very restricted sense that they used it. The same holds true for tools, such as fishing nets, spears, axes, and so on. They were possessions only inasmuch as they were used. The same principle exists in certain agricultural cooperatives today, where the individual does not own land, i.e., where he cannot sell it, and has a right to it only as long and to the extent to which he cultivates it. Among many primitive cultures without private property, the same principle applies to the relationship of man to woman and to the institution of marriage. A relationship is socially recognized as marriage as long as the man and the woman love each other, want and want to stay together. When the relationship loses this function, each one is free to leave because no one has the other. In contrast, with regard to institutional property, the law states that my house or my land, or my tools or my wife, or my children are my property, that I have them, and it does not matter whether I care for them. In fact, it is my right to destroy everything that is my property. I can burn my house, or a painting, even if it is a unique work of art. I do not owe an account to anybody for what I do with what is mine. This legal right is effective because the state supports my claim with its power. In the course of history, the concepts of property rights over wives and children and the corresponding laws have changed. Today, to kill one's wife is a crime that is punished as murder. To kill one's child is also considered a crime, but endless cruelties and brutalities by which parents assault their children is within the exercise of their legitimate authority, i.e., property rights, unless it goes to extremes that cannot be ignored. Nevertheless, in one's relationship to his wife and children, there have always been elements transcending pure possession. They were living beings. They were living in close contact with their master. He needed them, and they gave him pleasure. Hence, there was also an element of functional property in addition to legal property. Property in the form of capital is the extreme form of legal possession property. It could be said that capital is not different from a tool, for instance an axe, that its owner uses. But in the case of the axe, it becomes valuable only by its serving its owner's skill, i.e., as functional property. In the case of capital, the owner has it, even if he does nothing with it. It remains valuable even if it is not invested. But if the owner invests it, he does not have to use his skill or make any commensurate effort to bring him profit. The same holds true for the oldest form of capital, land. My legal right that makes me the owner permits me to gain profit from it without making any effort, i.e., without doing any work myself. It is for this reason that non-functional property may also be called dead property. Dead, or non-functional property, has its legitimacy in conquest or in law. But the law itself is backed up by force, and in this sense the difference between conquered property and legal property is only relative. Also, in the case of legal possession, force constitutes right, because the state guarantees my property right by force, of which the state has the monopoly. Man cannot exist without having, but he can exist very well with purely functional having, and has existed so for the first plus-minus 40,000 years of his history, since he emerged as Homo sapiens sapiens. Indeed, he can only, as I shall argue later, only exist sanely if he has mainly functional property and a minimum of dead property. Functional property is an existential and actual need of man. Institutional property satisfies pathological need, conditioned by certain socio-economic circumstances. Man must have a body, shelter, tools, weapons, vessels. These things are necessary for his biological existence. There are other things that he needs for his spiritual existence, such as ornaments and objects of decoration. Briefly, artistic and sacred objects, and the means to produce them. They can be property in the sense that an individual uses them exclusively, but they are functional property. With an increase in civilization, functional property in things increases. The individual may have several suits or dresses, a house, labor-saving devices, radio and television machines, record players and recordings, books, tennis rackets, a pair of skis. All these possessions need not be different from those functional possessions that exist in primitive cultures. They need not be, but they often are. The change of function happens at the point where possession ceases to be an instrument for greater aliveness and productivity, but is transformed into a means for passive receptive consumption. When having has primarily the function of satisfying the need for ever-increasing consumption, it ceases to be a condition for more being, but is basically no different from keeping possession. This statement may sound strange since keeping and spending are opposites. This is so indeed, if we look only at the surface. But seen dynamically, they share one fundamental quality. The miser, as well as the waster, is inwardly passive and unproductive. Neither is actively related to anything or anybody. Neither changes and grows in the process of living. Each only represents one of two different forms of non-aliveness. Showing the distinction between possession-having and use-having needs to take into account the double meaning of use: passive use, the consumer, and productive use, the artisan, artist, skilled worker. Functional having refers to productive use. Also, possessive having can have another function than that of gaining without having to make an effort. In the first place, dead property gives power to its owner in a society centered around property. The one who has much property is usually politically powerful. He appears to be a great man because he is a powerful man. People admire his greatness because they prefer to admire to being afraid. The rich and powerful man can influence others by intimidating them or by buying them. Hence, he acquires the possession of fame or admiration. Marx has given a beautiful analysis of this last point. That which exists for me through the medium of money, that which I can pay for, i.e., which money can buy, that I am, the possessor of the money. My own power is as great as the power of money. The properties of money are my own, the possessor's, properties and faculties. What I am and can do is therefore not at all determined by my individuality. I am ugly, but I can buy the most beautiful woman for myself. Consequently, I am not ugly, for the effect of ugliness, its power to repel, is annulled by money. As an individual I am lame, but money provides me with 24 legs. Therefore, I am not lame. I am a detestable, dishonorable, unscrupulous, and stupid man, but money is honored, and so also is its possessor. Money is the highest good, and so its possessor is good. Besides, money saves me the trouble of being dishonest. Therefore, I am presumed honest. I am stupid, but since money is the real mind of all things, how should its possessor be stupid? Moreover, he can buy talented people for himself, and is not he who has power over the talented more talented than they? I, who can have, through the power of money, everything for which the human heart longs, do I not possess all human abilities? Does not my money, therefore, transform all my incapacities into their opposites? If money is the bond which binds me to human life, and society to me, and which links me with nature and man, is it not the bond of all bonds? Is it not, therefore, also the universal agent of separation? It is the real means of both separation and union, the galvano-chemical power of society. Since money, as the existing and active concept of value, confounds and exchanges everything, it is the universal confusion and transposition of all things, the inverted world, the confusion and transposition of all natural and human qualities. He who can purchase bravery is brave, though a coward. Money is not exchanged for a particular quality, a particular thing, or a specific human faculty, but for the whole objective world of man and nature. Thus, from the standpoint of its possessor, it exchanges every quality and object for every other, even though they are contradictory. It is the fraternization of incompatibles. It forces contraries to embrace. Let us assume man to be man, and his relation to the world to be a human one. Then love can only be exchanged for love, trust for trust, etc. If you wish to enjoy art, you must be an artistically cultivated person. If you wish to influence other people, you must be a person who really has a stimulating and encouraging effect upon others. Every one of your relations to man and to nature must be a specific expression, corresponding to the object of your will, of your real individual life. If you love without evoking love in return, i.e., if you are not able, by the manifestation of yourself as a loving person, to make yourself a beloved person, then your love is impotent, and a misfortune. These considerations lead to the conclusion that the conventional classification of property in private and public, nationalized or socialized property, is insufficient and even misleading. What matters most is whether the property is functional, and hence non-exploitive, or whether it is dead, exploitive property. Even if the property belongs to the state, or even if it belongs to all those who work in the factory, it may give the command over others to the bureaucrats who control production. In fact, purely functional property, such as objects for use, were never considered by Marx and other socialists as private property that should be socialized. Nor does it matter whether the functional property is exactly equal for everybody. This concern with equality of property was never one of the socialists. It is, in actuality, deeply rooted in the spirit of property that, engendering envy, looks for the avoidance of any inequality because it would generate envy. The central issue is whether possession furthers the activity and aliveness of an individual, or whether it paralyzes his activity and furthers indolence, sloth, and unproductivity. 16. On the psychology of having. With this last remark, we enter into the discussion of having as a mental and affective phenomenon. Speaking about functional property first, it is clear that I can own no more than I can reasonably use. This coupling of owning and using has several consequences. 1. My activity is constantly stimulated because, having only what I use, I am constantly stimulated to be active. 2. The greediness to possess, avarice, can hardly develop, because I can only wish to have the amount of things that fit my capacity to use them productively. 3. I can hardly develop envy, since it would be useless to envy another for what he has when I am busy using what I have. And 4. I am not worried by the fear of losing what I have, since functional property is easily replaceable. Institutional possession is an entirely different experience. It is, aside from functional having and being, the other elementary mode of experience of oneself and the world. These two modes of experience are to be found in almost everybody. Rare are those who do not experience having at all. Far more numerous are those for whom it is almost the only experience they know. Most people are characterized by the particular blending of the having and being modes in their character structure. Yet simple as the concept and word having seems to be, to describe the experience of the having mode is difficult, especially because such a description can succeed only if the reader responds not only intellectually, but tries to mobilize his affective experience with having. Perhaps the most helpful approach to the understanding of having, in the non-functional sense, is to recall one of the most significant insights of Freud. He found that after the infant goes through a phase of mere passive receptivity, followed by one of aggressive, exploitative receptivity, the child, before it reaches maturity, goes through a phase that Freud designated as the anal erotic phase, which often remains dominant in the development of a person and leads to the development of the anal character. In this context, it is of little importance that Freud believed a special phase of the libido development was primary, and that character formation was secondary, whereas, in my opinion, as well as in that of authors closer to Freud, like Erik Erikson, the relation is in the reverse. What matters is the view that the predominant orientation toward possession is seen by Freud as the period before the achievement of full maturity, and as pathological if it remains permanent. In other words, for Freud, the person exclusively concerned with having and possession is an erotic, mentally sick person. This point of view may have been a bombshell within a society that is based on private property, and whose members experience themselves and their relationship to the world predominantly in terms of possession. Yet, as far as I know, no one protested against this attack on the highest values of bourgeois society, while Freud's modest attempts to de-demonize sex were met with a howl by all defenders of decency. It is not easy to explain this paradox. Was the reason that scarcely anybody connected individual psychology with social psychology? Was it that the supreme moral value of ownership was so undisputed that nobody picked up the challenge? Or was it that Freud's attack on middle-class sexual mores was so bitterly scorned because the attack served as a defense against one's own hypocrisy, while the public's attitude toward money and possessions was completely genuine and no aggressive defense was needed? However this may be, there is no doubt that Freud believed that possessiveness, as such, i.e. having, was an unhealthful orientation, if it was dominant in an adult person. He brought to bear several kinds of data to establish his theory. First of all, those rich data in which excrements were symbolically equated with money, possession, and dirt. There is indeed ample linguistic, folkloric, and mythical data to bear this out. Freud had already, in a letter to Fleiss of December 22, 1897, associated money and miserliness with feces. In his classic paper, Character and Anal Eroticism, 1908, he added more examples to this symbolic identity. The connections between the complexes of interest in money and of defecation, which seem so dissimilar, appear to be the most extensive of all. Every doctor who has practiced psychoanalysis knows that the most refractory and long-standing cases of what is described as habitual constipation in neurotics can be cured by that form of treatment. This is less surprising if we remember that function has shown itself similarly amenable to hypnotic suggestion. But in psychoanalysis, one only achieves this result if one deals with the patient's money complex and induces them to bring it into consciousness with all its connections. It might be supposed that the neurosis is here only following an indication of common usage in speech, which calls a person who keeps too careful a hold on his money dirty or filthy. But this explanation would be far too superficial. In reality, wherever archaic modes of thought have predominated or persist, in the ancient civilizations, in myths, fairy tales, and superstitions, in unconscious thinking, in dreams, and in neuroses, money is brought into the most intimate relationship with dirt. We know that the gold which the devil gives his paramours turns into excrement after his departure, and the devil is certainly nothing else than the personification of the repressed unconscious instinctual life. We also know about the superstition which connects the finding of treasure with defecation, and everyone is familiar with the figure of the shitter of ducats, Dukatenscheißer. Indeed, even according to ancient Babylonian doctrine, gold is the feces of hell. Mammon equals ilu mammon. Thus, in following the usage of language, neurosis, here as elsewhere, is taking words in their original significant sense, and where it appears to be using a word figuratively, it is usually simply restoring its old meaning. It is possible that the contrast between the most precious substance known to men and the most worthless, which they reject as waste matter, refuse, has led to this specific identification of gold with feces. A few words of comment are indicated. In the Babylonian notion that gold is the feces of hell, the connection is made between gold, feces, and death. In hell, meaning the world of the dead, the most valuable object is feces, and this brings together the notion of money, dirt, and the dead. The last of the two paragraphs quoted here is very revealing of Freud's dependency on the thinking of his day. Seeking the reason for the symbolic identity of gold and feces, he proposes the hypothesis that their identity may be based on the very fact of their radical contrast, gold being the most precious and feces the most worthless substance known to man. Freud ignores the other possibility that gold is the most precious substance for civilization, whose economy is generally based on gold, but that this holds by no means for those primitive societies for which gold may not have had any great value. More importantly, while the pattern of his society suggests that man think of gold as the most precious substance, he may unconsciously carry a notion that gold is dead, sterile like salt, without life except when used in jewelry, that it is amassed labor meant to be hoarded, the foremost example of possession without function. Can one eat gold? Can one make anything grow with gold, except when it has been transformed into capital? This dead, sterile aspect of gold is shown in the myth of King Midas. He was so avaricious that his wish was granted that everything he touched became gold. Eventually he had to die precisely because one cannot live from gold. In this myth is a clear vision of the sterility of gold, and it is by no means the highest value, as Freud assumed. Freud was too much a son of his time to be aware of the negative value of money and possession, and hence of the critical implications of his concept of the anal character, which I discussed above. Regardless of the merits of Freud's scheme of libido development, his findings about the receptive and possessive stages as one of the earliest stages of human development make much sense. The first years in the child's life are necessarily a period during which the infant is not capable of taking care of itself, to form the surrounding world according to its wishes under its own powers. It is forced either to receive, to snatch, or to possess, because it cannot yet produce. Thus, the category of having is a necessary transitional stage in the child's development. But if possessiveness remains the dominant experience in the adult, it indicates that he has not achieved the goal of normal development to productivity, but has become stuck in the experience of having, because of this failure in his development. Here, as with other orientations, what is normal at an early stage of evolution becomes pathological if it occurs at a later stage. Possessive having is based on the reduction of the capacity for productive activity. This reduction can be traced to many factors. By productive activity, I understand the free, active expression of one's faculties, not the actions motivated by instincts or by the compulsive need to act in certain ways. This is not the place to take up this discussion. Suffice it to say here that we must look for factors such as early intimidation, lack of stimulation, over-pampering, both individually and socially. But the sequence also goes the other way round. The having orientation and its satisfaction weakens the effort and eventually the capacity to make productive efforts. The more a person has, the less is he attracted to making active efforts. Having and inner laziness ultimately form a vicious circle, reinforcing each other. Let us look at an example of a person whose total orientation is one of having. The miser. The most obvious object of possession for him is money and its material equivalents such as land, houses, movable property, etc. Most of his energy is directed toward keeping it, more by saving and non-use rather than by business activities and speculation. He experiences himself as if he were a fortress. Nothing must leave it. Hence, nothing must be spent beyond what is absolutely necessary. And what this absolutely necessary is depends on the degree of his miserliness. It is exceptional, though not rare, that a person would deprive himself of all amenities of life, such as pleasant food, nice clothing, and decent housing, in order to reduce his expenses to almost nothing. The average person is puzzled why a person should deprive himself of all enjoyments. But one must not forget that this is not really the case. The miser finds the greatest enjoyment precisely in the experience of his possession. To have is for him a sweeter pleasure than beauty, love, or any sensuous or intellectual pleasure. The rich miser presents a picture that is sometimes less obvious. He may even spend millions in philanthropy or for art, because it is an expense that, aside from tax advantages, is demanded by his social status and because of the publicity value of a favorable image. But he may go to great lengths to set up a control system that ensures him against any unnecessary expenditure of postage, or he may make compulsive efforts to prevent his workers losing even 1 minute of their working time. Bennett even reports that Henry Ford, the founder of the automobile dynasty, wore socks until they could hardly be mended anymore, and being afraid of his wife secretly buying new socks in a store, changed them in his car and threw away the old ones on the way. The miser is not only driven by the passion to save things, but equally by that of saving energy, feelings, thought, or anything else that one can have. For him, energy is a fixed amount which he has, and which cannot be replenished. Hence, every expenditure of energy that is not absolutely necessary must be avoided, because it diminishes his stock of it. He avoids unnecessary physical efforts, does everything in the shortest possible way. Usually, he works out pedantic, orderly methods for maximal reduction of energy consumption. This attitude often becomes manifest in his sexual behavior. This manifestation is obviously to be found mostly among men. To him, semen is a most precious product, but limited in quantity. Whatever is spent of it is lost forever. That he knows intellectually that this is not so has little effect on the way he feels about it. Therefore, he must reduce sexual intercourse to a minimum, in order to lose only a minimum of semen. I have known quite a number of men who had worked out a system to achieve the optimal compromise between the demands of saving and of health, which, they thought, demands a certain amount of sexual activity. This complex is sometimes at the root of male impotence. In the same way, the miser tends to save words, feelings, and thoughts. He does not want to spend energy in feeling or thinking. He needs this energy for the necessary and unavoidable tasks of life. He remains cold and indifferent to the joys and sorrows of others, even his own. As a substitute for a live experience, he substitutes the memory of past experiences. These memories are a precious possession, and often he goes over them in thought as he would count his money, his cattle, or his industrial stocks. In fact, the memory of past feelings or experiences is the only form in which he is in touch with his own experiences. He is feeling little, but he is sentimental. Sentimental being used here in the sense of feelingless feelings, the thought of or the daydreams of feelings, rather than felt feelings. It is a well-known fact that many possessive, cold, and even cruel people, and the three belong together, who are not moved by human suffering that is real, can shed tears when a movie presents one of those constellations that they remember from their own childhood, or that they think of in daydreams. We have so far ignored the differences in the objects possessed, along with the respective difference in the experience of possessing them. Probably the most important difference is between non-living and living objects. Non-living objects, money, land, and jewelry, do not oppose their owner. The only opposition could come from social and political forces that threaten the safe and secure possession of property. The most important guarantee for this security is the law and the exercise of force by the state, which make it effective. Those whose inner security is by and large based on possession are necessarily conservative and ardent opponents of movements that want to reduce the state's monopoly of force. For those whose security rests on the possession of living beings, especially of human beings, the situation is more complex. They, too, are dependent on the state's capacity of enforcing the law, but they are also confronted with the resistance of the human being to being possessed, to being transformed into a thing that can be had and controlled. This statement may be questioned by some. They will point out the fact that millions of people are satisfied with being ruled, in fact that they prefer control to freedom. In Escape from Freedom, 1941, I attempted myself to point to this fear of freedom and to the attraction of unfreedom. But the apparent contradiction is not insoluble. To be free, rather than to have security, is frightening to anyone who has not acquired the courage for the adventure of being. He is willing to give up his freedom if his coercion is made to appear as non-coercion, if the controller is given the features of a benign father, if he feels he is not a thing controlled but a loved child guided. But where this disguise is not used and the object of possession is aware of what happens to him, his first reaction is that of resistance, in all forms and with all means. The child resists with the weapons of the helpless, sabotage and obstruction. More specifically, his weapons are bedwetting, constipation, temper tantrums, and so on. The helpless classes react sometimes by sabotage or inefficiency, but, as history shows, often by frank rebellions and revolutions, which are the birth pains of new developments. Whatever form the fight against domination takes, it has a deep influence on the one who wants to control. He must develop the passionate striving to control others, and this drive becomes a passion charged with lust. The attempt to possess, have human beings necessarily leads to the development of sadism, one of the ugliest and most perverted of passions. The ultimate object of having is to have oneself. I have myself means I am full with myself. I am what I have, and I have what I am. The true representative of this type of person is the full-fledged narcissist. He is filled only with himself. He transforms the whole world into something he owns. He is not interested in anything or anybody outside himself, except as objects to be incorporated into his sphere of possessions. A mode of experience that is fundamentally akin to that of having is consuming. Again, we can easily distinguish between functional, rational, and non-functional, irrational consumption. If I eat because my hunger indicates my body's need for food, or because I enjoy food, my eating is functional and rational, in the sense that it serves the healthful operation of my entire organism, including my educated taste. But if I overeat out of greed, depression, or anxiety, my eating is irrational. It harms and does not further me physiologically or mentally. This holds true for all consumption, which is rooted in greed and has an obsessional character, in avarice, drug addiction, in the consumerism of today, and for sexual consumption. What appears today as a great pleasure-producing sexual passion is actually only an expression of greed, an attempt to devour each other. It is an attempt of two people, or one of two, to take full possession of the other. People sometimes describe their most ardent sexual experiences in words such as, "we fell upon each other." Indeed, they do. They fall upon each other like hungry wolves, and the basic mood is that of hostile possessiveness, and not that of joy, not to speak of love. To fill oneself up with people, food, or other things is a more archaic form of possession and having. In the latter case, The object I have can still be taken away from me by superior force, trickery, and so on. My possession requires a social situation that guarantees my title. If I introject the object I want to keep, it is safe from all interference. Nobody can rob me of what I have swallowed. This first type of having can be clearly seen in the infant's attempt to take things into its mouth. This is his first way of securely having. But of course, as far as physical objects are concerned, the method of introjection is extremely limited. Strictly speaking, it can occur only with objects that are edible and not harmful to the organism. Cannibalism may have one of its roots here. If I believe that the body of a man, especially of a strong and brave man, gives strength, eating it would be the archaic equivalent of acquiring a slave. But there is a type of consumption that is not necessarily by mouth. The best example is the private automobile. It can be argued that such is functional property, and for this reason not equivalent to dead possession. This would be true if the private car were really functional, but it is not. It does not stimulate or activate any of man's powers. It is a distraction, enables a person to run away from himself, produces a false sense of strength, helps to form a sense of identity based on the brand of car the man drives. It prevents him from walking and thinking, is sufficiently exacting to make a concentrated conversation impossible, and stimulates competition. One would need to write a book in order to give a full description of the irrational and pathogenic function of the type of consumption that the private automobile represents. To sum up, non-functional, hence pathogenic consumption, is similar to having. Both types of experience weaken or even destroy man's productive development, deprive him of aliveness, and transform him into a thing. I hope the experience of having and non-functional consumption will still become clearer as we go on contrasting it with its opposite, the experience of being. Part 6. 17. From having to well-being. If well-being, in the sense defined in the beginning of this book, functioning well as a person, not as an instrument, is the supreme goal of one's efforts, two specific ways stand out that lead to the attainment of this goal: breaking through one's narcissism and breaking through the property structure of one's existence. Narcissism is an orientation in which all one's interest and passion are directed to one's own person, one's body, mind, feelings, interests, and so forth. Indeed, like Narcissus, the narcissistic person could be said to be in love with himself, if infatuation may be called love. For the narcissistic person, only he and what concerns him are fully real. What is outside, what concerns others, is real only in a superficial sense of perception. That is to say, it is real for one's senses and for one's intellect, but it is not real in a deeper sense, for our feeling or understanding. He is, in fact, aware only of what is outside, inasmuch as it affects him. Hence he has no love, no compassion, no rational objective judgment. The narcissistic person has built an invisible wall around himself. He is everything. The world is nothing, or rather, he is the world. The extreme examples of almost total narcissism are the newborn infant and the insane person. They both are incapable of relating to the world. Actually, the insane person is not totally unrelated, as it was assumed by Freud and others. He has withdrawn. The infant cannot withdraw, because it has not yet opened up anything beyond a solipsistic orientation. Freud referred to this difference by distinguishing between primary and secondary narcissism. However, the fact has been neglected that the normal adult can also be narcissistic, even though not to the degree to be found in these extremes. Often he shows his narcissism quite openly, although he is not aware of being narcissistic. He thinks, speaks, and acts only in reference to himself, showing no really genuine interest in the world outside. On the contrary, the great man finds himself so interesting that it is only logical that he wants us to enjoy the manifestations of his greatness. If he is intelligent, witty, charming, powerful, rich, or famous, the average person will take no exception to his narcissistic exhibitionism. Many people, however, often try to hide their narcissism by being particularly modest and humble, or in the subtle form of being concerned with religious, occult, or political matters that all seem to point beyond the private interest. Narcissism can hide in so many disguises that it can be said to be the most difficult of all psychic qualities to discover, and then only as a result of hard work and vigilance. Yet if one does not discover and reduce it considerably, the further way to self-completion is blocked. Similar, yet quite different from narcissism, are egotism and selfishness, the results of the property or having mode of existence. A person living in this mode is not necessarily very narcissistic. He may have broken through the shell of his narcissism, have an adequate appreciation of reality outside himself, not necessarily be in love with himself. He knows who he is and who the others are, and can well distinguish between subjective experience and reality. Nevertheless, he wants everything for himself, has no pleasure in giving, in sharing, in solidarity, in cooperation, in love. He is a closed fortress, suspicious of others, eager to take and most reluctant to give. He represents, by and large, the anal hoarding character. He is lonely, unrelated, and his strength lies in what he has and in the security of keeping it. On the other hand, the very narcissistic person is by no means necessarily selfish, egocentric, or property-oriented. He can be generous, giving, and tender, although all these characteristics must be qualified by the fact that to him the other person is not fully experienced as real. Yet one can easily observe very narcissistic persons whose spontaneous impulses are generous and giving rather than hoarding and holding. Since the two orientations, narcissism and selfishness, are rarely wholly differentiated, we must accept that, for growth, a double breakthrough is necessary, that through one's narcissism and that through one's having orientation. The first condition for overcoming one's selfishness lies in the capacity of being aware of it. This is an easier task than the awareness of one's narcissism, because one's judgment is much less distorted, one can recognize facts more easily, and because it is less easy to hide. Of course, recognition of one's egocentricity is a necessary condition of overcoming it, but by no means a sufficient one. The second step to take is gaining an awareness of the roots of the having orientation, such as one's sense of powerlessness, one's fear of life, one's fear of the uncertain, one's distrust of people, and the many other subtle roots that have grown together so thickly that it often is impossible to uproot them. Awareness of these roots is not sufficient condition either. It must be accompanied by changes in practice, first of all by loosening the grip that selfishness has over one by beginning to let go. One must give up something, share, and go through the anxiety that these first little steps engender. One will discover then the fear of losing oneself that develops if one contemplates losing things, which function as props for one's sense of self. This implies not only giving up some possessions, but even more important, habits, accustomed thoughts, identification with one's status, even phrases one is accustomed to hold on to, as well as the image that others may have of oneself, or that one hopes they have, and tries to produce. In brief, if one tries to change routinized behavior in all spheres of life, from breakfast routine to sex routine. In the process of trying to do so, anxieties are mobilized, and by not yielding to them, confidence grows that the seemingly impossible can be done, and adventurousness grows. This process must be accompanied by attempting to go out of oneself and to turn to others. What does this mean? Something very simple if we put it into words. One way of describing it is that our attention is drawn to others, to the world of nature, of ideas, of art, of social and political events. We become interested in the world outside of our ego in the literal meaning of interest, which comes from the Latin inter esse, i.e., to be among, or to be over there, rather than to be shut in within oneself. This development of interest can be compared to a situation in which a person has seen and can describe a swimming pool. He has spoken about it from the outside. His description has been correct, yet without interest. But when he has jumped into the pool, and when he has become wet and then speaks about the pool, he speaks as a different person about a different pool. Now he and the pool are not opposing each other, although they have not become identical either. The development of interest means to jump and not to remain an outsider, an observer, a person separated from what he sees. If a person has the will and the determination to loosen the bars of his prison of narcissism and selfishness, when he has the courage to tolerate the intermittent anxiety, he experiences the first glimpses of joy and strength that he sometimes attains. And only then a decisive new factor enters into the dynamics of the process. This new experience becomes the decisive motivation for going ahead and following the path he has charted. Until then, his own dissatisfaction and rational considerations of all kinds can guide him. But these considerations can carry him only for a short while. They will lose their power if the new element does not enter, experience of well-being, fleeting and small as it may be, which feels so superior to anything experienced so far, that it becomes the most powerful motivation for further progress, one that becomes stronger in and of itself the further progress goes on. To sum up once more, awareness, will, practice, tolerance of fear and of new experience, they are all necessary if transformation of the individual is to succeed. At a certain point, the energy and direction of inner forces have changed to the point where an individual's sense of identity is changed too. In the property mode of existence, the motto is, I am what I have. After the breakthrough, it is, I am what I do, in the sense of unalienated activity, or simply, I am what I am.